So this is a study, Chesthetica's computer-generated chess problem 00988. Now white is down by about 1 pawn unit, but white can actually win in this position. I will now show you the solution. So the winning move here is bishop to c6. Now what happens if black decides to capture this quote-unquote free bishop? Well, then white continues with rook to e8 check, bishop to d8, and then not rook captures d8, which also wins, but the more powerful a7 check. And note that this pawn is defended by the bishop on g1. King moves to maybe b7. Now rook captures d8. Black moves to a6 with his rook. Note that here, promoting to a8 would be a mistake that leads to a draw, because after rook captures queen and rook captures rook and king captures rook, white only has a bishop against a bishop and 2 pawns, which is basically a theoretical draw. So the correct way to proceed is not to move the pawn up, but to move the rook to b8 to push the king slightly away, and now white can proceed with the promotion or even gain some time with rook captures g8. Then if the king were to move back, the rook simply repeats the sequence earlier. Rook to b8 check, king to c7, now promotes to queen. And after the exchange, white is comfortably ahead in material and will win the game without a doubt. So obviously capturing the bishop is not the way to proceed for black. Black should therefore proceed with f2, because this blocks off the bishop on g1 from the defense of the pawn on a6. But still, white continues with rook to e8 check. Black intervenes, bishop to d8, and now bishop captures f2. If the bishop doesn't capture f2, if rook captures d8, then king to c7 tends to lead to a draw, because now the bishop on g1 is under threat, and so is the rook. White must play bishop captures f2, and after king captures d8, we have 2 bishops and a pawn against a rook, bishop, and pawn, which is again a theoretical draw. So at this point, bishop captures f2. White does not capture the bishop on d8 with his rook yet, or even the other bishop. What happens if white decides to capture the other bishop? Well, then here, if black were to capture this bishop, and then white recaptures, black can capture the bishop on c6, and then black is winning. Or at this point, black can simply promote to a queen and pin the bishop on g1, and black is also winning, because after a7, king to c7, and then if a8 moves to queen, well, that would be a rook to h3 mate. So white has to be careful with maybe a rook to g7, king to d6, bishop to g2, queen to a1, and black has something of an advantage here. White might proceed again with the promotion, then black would play rook to h3 check, bishop captures h3, queen captures a8 check, bishop to g2, and basically black is ahead in material and white is somewhat on the defensive. So let's roll back a bit again. Bishop to c6, black proceeds with pawn to f2, rook to e8 check, bishop to d8. White must capture this pawn first, and black now captures the bishop. Now white captures the d8 bishop. If he were to capture the g8 bishop, again this would lead to a draw, because rook captures a6, and even after rook captures d8 check, king to c7, a rook and a bishop against a rook and a pawn is a draw. If the rooks are exchanged, a bishop on its own cannot checkmate a lone king, much less a lone king and a pawn. So precise play is very important in this particular study. Rook captures d8 is the way to go. If black were to play king to c7 here, well then a7, and now it's very difficult to stop the pawn from promoting. Maybe rook to c1 check, king to g2, king to d8, and then the pawn promotes to queen, and black is losing. So the proper response here is rook to c8, and white plays bishop to g3 check, and after this, king to a7, rook captures c8, bishop to d5 check, king to h2, king captures a6, rook to b8, bishop to f3, bishop to f4, and white is basically winning with a rook and a bishop against a bishop and a pawn. Now at this point, if instead of playing king to a7, black plays king to a8, he loses even more quickly because after rook captures c8, black must deal with the check that is moving to a7, and this gives time for white to capture the bishop. So black is down even more material. Whereas in the previous variation, the king moving to a7 and then rook capturing rook, the bishop has time to escape with a check. For example, bishop to d5. And it's more difficult for white to win, even though white still wins. So looking back at the original position, I'm not sure it would be very obvious that bishop to c6 is the move that changes everything in this constructed study. Quite an interesting position if I do say so myself. Thank you for watching. Until next time.